The evening sun cast long shadows across the well-manicured lawns of Hartford's wealthiest neighborhood. Officer Robert Chen sat in his patrol car, drumming his fingers against the steering wheel as he watched the expensive homes with their perfectly trimmed hedges. 15 years on the force had left him with deeply rooted beliefs about who belonged in this neighborhood and who didn't. The call came in at 7:45 p.m. A resident reported suspicious activity near the medical center. Chen's jaw tightened as he started his car. These calls usually meant someone who didn't fit the profile of the area was walking around. He'd made countless arrests based on such calls, and each one had reinforced his prejudices. As he pulled into the medical center's parking lot, he spotted a well-dressed black man standing near a Tesla, phone in hand. The man wore an expensive suit and carried a leather briefcase, but Chen didn't let these details register. All he saw was what he wanted to see, someone who, in his mind, didn't belong. The man was checking his rideshare app, waiting for his driver to arrive after a long day of performing complex surgeries. He was actually the hospital's newest head of cardiology, having moved to Hartford just 3 months ago. But Chen didn't know any of this. He didn't want to know. Chen stepped out of his patrol car, hand resting on his holster. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step away from that vehicle," he called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone who expected immediate compliance. The doctor looked up, surprised but composed. He'd been through similar situations before and had learned to stay calm, even when facing unwarranted suspicion. "Officer, I'm just waiting for my ride," he explained, his voice steady and professional. He reached slowly for the ID badge clipped to his suit jacket, but Chen interpreted the movement as threatening. Within seconds, the situation escalated. "Hands where I can see them." Chen barked, drawing his weapon. The doctor froze, his heart racing, but his exterior remaining remarkably composed. Several nurses leaving their shift stopped to watch the scene unfold, their faces showing mixture of shock and disgust at what they were witnessing. Chen approached with the confidence of someone who believed he was always right, who had never needed to question his actions or motivations. He roughly cuffed the doctor, ignoring the man's attempts to explain his position at the hospital. The expensive suit, the professional demeanor, the hospital ID visible on his jacket. Chen dismissed it all, seeing only what his prejudices allowed him to see. As Chen led him to the patrol car, a young nurse ran up, trying to intervene. "Officer, wait. That's doctor." But Chen cut her off with a sharp wave of his hand. He wasn't interested in explanations that might contradict his assumptions. The doctor met the nurse's eyes and gave a small shake of his head, silently asking her not to put herself at risk. The drive to the station was tense and silent. Chen kept glancing in his rearview mirror at his passenger, who sat with perfect posture despite the handcuffs, his face a mask of dignity under pressure. The doctor wasn't angry. He'd experienced enough discrimination to know that anger rarely helped. Instead, he was already thinking about how this incident could be turned into a teaching moment, though he had no idea just how personal that lesson would become for Officer Chen. Little did Chen know that in less than 24 hours, his entire worldview would be shattered. The man he was arresting wasn't just any doctor. He was the only surgeon in the state qualified to perform a very specific and complex cardiac procedure. A procedure that Chen's mother desperately needed the very next morning. At the police station, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Officer Chen led the doctor through the booking process. The night shift officers looked up from their desks, some with raised eyebrows at the sight of a man in what was clearly a $1,000 suit being processed for a minor offense. "Stand against the wall," Chen ordered, his voice carrying that same edge of superiority it always did in these situations. The doctor complied without argument, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to Chen's barely hidden hostility. As the camera flashed for the booking photo, the doctor kept his head high, his dignity intact. One of the younger officers, Officer Thompson, watched the scene with growing discomfort. She'd seen that hospital ID badge when they first came in, and something didn't sit right. But Chen was a senior officer, and an unwritten code kept most officers from questioning each other's arrests. The doctor spoke softly, but firmly as Chen filled out the paperwork. "Officer, I understand you're doing your job, but I need to make a phone call. I have surgery scheduled for tomorrow morning." Chen scoffed, not even bothering to look up from his forms. "Sure you do," he muttered, his tone dripping with disbelief. At the booking desk, Chen's fingers pecked at the keyboard, typing out his version of events: suspicious behavior, failure to comply, potential vehicle theft. Each tap of the keys further cemented his narrative, one that conveniently left out the doctor's professional appearance and calm cooperation. The holding cell was empty that night, its steel benches cold and uninviting. The doctor sat down, his expensive suit jacket now wrinkled from the ordeal. He closed his eyes, not in despair, but in quiet contemplation. He'd faced prejudice before, but tonight felt different, perhaps because lives literally hung in the balance. Officer Thompson couldn't shake her unease. During her break, she decided to make a quick call to the hospital, just to check. What she learned made her stomach drop. Rushing back inside, she found her supervisor, Lieutenant Rivera, and whispered urgently in his ear. The lieutenant's face darkened as he listened. He immediately picked up his phone, and within minutes, the station's atmosphere began to shift. Word spread quickly. Their prisoner wasn't just any doctor, but one of the top cardiac surgeons in the country. Chen was in the break room when Lieutenant Rivera found him. A word, "officer." The lieutenant's tone made it clear this wasn't a request. As they walked to his office, Chen maintained his usual confident stride, still convinced he'd done everything by the book. Inside the office, Rivera didn't mince words. "Do you know who that man is?" he asked, his voice level but intense. Chen shrugged, the gesture revealing his indifference. "Just another guy where he doesn't belong." "That guy is the new head of cardiology at Hartford Medical Center," Rivera said, watching Chen's face carefully. "He's scheduled to perform 3 major surgeries tomorrow morning." Chen's expression didn't change. Not yet. Then Rivera delivered the blow that would shake Chen's world to its core. "One of those patients," Rivera continued, his eyes locked on Chen's, "is your mother." The color drained from Chen's face as the reality of his actions began to sink in. His mother had been waiting months for this surgery, her condition deteriorating. They'd been told only a handful of surgeons in the country could perform the complex procedure she needed. And he had just arrested one of them. The weight of his prejudice, the cost of his assumptions, crashed down on Chen all at once. He gripped the edge of Rivera's desk, his knees suddenly weak. The man he'd treated with such disdain held his mother's life in his skilled hands. Outside the office, the doctor sat calmly in the holding cell, reviewing his surgeries for the next day in his mind. Despite everything that had happened, his primary concern remained his patients. He knew that somewhere in the hospital, families were counting on him, including, though he didn't know it yet, the family of the very officer who had arrested him. The next hour at the police station felt like a blur. Officer Chen sat in the break room, his coffee growing cold in front of him, as the full impact of his actions sank in. His hands trembled slightly as he thought about his mother in her hospital bed, waiting for tomorrow's surgery. A surgery that might not happen because of his prejudice. Down the hall, Lieutenant Rivera was personally handling the doctor's release. "I apologize for this entire situation," Rivera said as he removed the handcuffs. The doctor rubbed his wrists gently, his face showing no anger, just quiet understanding. He'd been through worse, but he knew this incident might lead to something different. "Your belongings are all here," Rivera continued, pushing forward a plastic bag containing the doctor's phone and wallet. "We've called a car service for you." The doctor checked his phone. Multiple missed calls from the hospital, from his family. He'd need to make several calls tonight, review his surgical charts again. A lesser man might have let this incident affect tomorrow's performance, but that wasn't who he was. As the doctor prepared to leave, Chen appeared in the doorway. His usual confident stance was gone, replaced by something unfamiliar to him: uncertainty. The doctor looked at him, and for the first time that night, their eyes truly met. In that moment, Chen didn't see a suspect or a threat. He saw a human being, one who held his mother's life in his hands. "Doctor, Chen's voice cracked, something none of his fellow officers had ever heard before. The words stuck in his throat. How do you apologize for something like this? How do you face the man you wrongly arrested when you need him to save your mother's life?" The doctor raised his hand, stopping Chen's stumbling apology. "Officer Chen, I have 3 surgeries tomorrow morning. One of them, I believe, is your mother." His voice was steady, professional. "I need to review my charts and get some rest. We can discuss this another time." Chen felt the weight of shame pressing down on him. "My mother, will you still?" He couldn't finish the sentence. The doctor's response surprised everyone in the room. "Your mother's surgery is scheduled for 7 a.m. I'll be there, just as planned. She deserves nothing less than my best, regardless of what happened tonight." Lieutenant Rivero watched this exchange with a mix of emotions. In his 20 years on the force, he'd seen countless cases of prejudice, but rarely had he witnessed its consequences play out so personally. As the doctor left the station, his car service waiting outside, Chen collapsed into a nearby chair. The night shift officers pretended not to notice as their colleague, known for his tough exterior, buried his face in his hands. Officer Thompson brought him a fresh cup of coffee, placing it silently in front of him. In the quiet of the late night, the station hummed with an uncomfortable energy. The incident would have repercussions. There would be reports to file, reviews to conduct, difficult conversations to have. But for now, all Chen could think about was his mother, and the man he had wrongly judged who would be operating on her in just a few hours. At home, the doctor settled into his study, spreading out his surgical charts. His wife brought him tea, asking about the delayed return home. He shared the story quietly, and she held his hand, understanding the weight he carried. Not just the technical complexity of tomorrow's surgeries, but the human complexity of the situation. As midnight approached, both men lay awake in their respective homes. The doctor reviewed surgical procedures in his mind, his commitment to his patients unchanged by the night's events. And Chen stared at his ceiling, confronting truths about himself he'd spent years avoiding, while prayers for his mother's surgery ran through his mind. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight had already changed everything. Sometimes the harshest lessons come wrapped in the most personal packages, and for Officer Chen, this lesson was just beginning. Sleep refused to come to Officer Chen that night. He paced his apartment's small living room, the city lights casting shadows through the blinds. Every few minutes, he checked his phone, though he knew there wouldn't be any updates about his mother until morning. The weight of his actions pressed down on him like a physical thing. Around 2 a.m., he found himself sitting on his couch, looking at old family photos. There was one of his mother at his police academy graduation, beaming with pride. She had raised him alone after his father passed away, working 2 jobs to give him opportunities. Now, when she needed him most, he had nearly sabotaged her chance at survival because of his prejudices. His phone buzzed. A text from his aunt, who was staying with his mother at the hospital. "She's sleeping peacefully. Try to rest." But rest seemed impossible. Every time Chen closed his eyes, he saw the doctor's face, dignified even in handcuffs. He saw the expensive suit he'd wrinkled, the hospital ID badge he'd ignored, the calm explanations he'd dismissed. Desperate for distraction, Chen turned on his laptop and did something he'd never done before. He looked up the doctor's credentials. The screen filled with academic achievements, published papers, and news articles about groundbreaking surgeries. Awards, recognition, lives saved. Chen felt sick to his stomach. All this information had been just a few clicks away, but he'd chosen to see only what his biased mind wanted to see. Down the hall, he could hear his neighbor's baby crying. Usually, the sound irritated him, but tonight it just reminded him of life. Fragile, precious life, the kind the doctor worked to save every day. The kind of life his mother was fighting for. Around 3 a.m., Chen found himself in his bathroom, staring at his reflection in the mirror. "What kind of cop are you?" he whispered to himself. The question echoed in his mind, forcing him to confront uncomfortable truths. How many other times had he judged someone wrongly? How many lives had he impacted because of his prejudices? He thought about his fellow officers, Thompson's discomfort, Rivera's disappointment. They had seen what he refused to see. Even the young nurse at the hospital had tried to tell him, but he wouldn't listen. His badge, meant to represent justice, had become a shield for his biases. As the night grew deeper, Chen pulled out his uniform for the next day. He had taken the day off to be at the hospital for his mother's surgery, but looking at the blue fabric now made him question everything. The uniform was supposed to represent protection and service, not prejudice and power abuse. His mother had always taught him to judge people by their character, not their appearance. Somewhere along the way, he had forgotten that lesson. The irony was bitter. It took arresting one of the few people who could save his mother's life to make him remember. Around 4 a.m., exhausted but still unable to sleep, Chen made coffee and sat by his window. The city was quiet, that peculiar stillness before dawn. Somewhere out there, the doctor was probably preparing for surgery. Chen thought about the doctor's composure, his professionalism even in the face of injustice. That level of character seemed almost impossible to comprehend. The sky began to lighten, painting the city in shades of gray and purple. In a few hours, his mother would be wheeled into an operating room, her life in the hands of a man Chen had humiliated just hours before. The doctor had promised to do his best, showing a humanity that Chen had failed to extend to him. As the first rays of sunlight touched the city, Chen made a promise to himself. Whether his mother's surgery succeeded or failed, things would have to change. His badge would have to mean something different from now on. The night's darkness had forced him to face his own darkness, and the coming dawn would have to bring something new. But first, he had to face what waited at the hospital. Both the uncertainty of his mother's surgery and the reality of his own actions. The hardest part of the journey was just beginning. The hospital corridor buzzed with early morning activity as Chen arrived at 6:15 a.m. His tie felt too tight, his civilian clothes strange after so many years of wearing a uniform to important events. Nurses and doctors rushed past him, their shoes squeaking on the polished floor. Every time someone in scrubs walked by, his heart jumped, thinking it might be the doctor. His mother was already being prepped for surgery when he reached her room. She looked small in the hospital bed, her gray hair neatly combed by his aunt, who had stayed with her all night. "Robert," she smiled weakly, reaching for his hand. "You look tired, son. Didn't you sleep?" Chen forced a smile, squeezing her hand gently. How could he tell her what had happened? How could he explain that he had almost ruined her chance at survival? "Just worried about you, Mom," he managed to say. The guilt sat in his stomach like a stone. The pre-op nurse came in, checking vital signs one last time. Chen watched the routine with growing anxiety. Each beep of the heart monitor reminded him of time passing, of what was at stake. His aunt touched his shoulder, mistaking his tension for normal pre-surgery worry. At 6:45 a.m., they began wheeling his mother toward the operating room. Chen walked alongside until they reached the double doors marked Authorized Personnel Only. His mother squeezed his hand one last time. "I'll see you soon," she said with a confidence he wished he could feel. In the waiting room, Chen couldn't sit still. He paced, got coffee he didn't drink, flipped through magazines without seeing the pages. Other families sat nearby, each lost in their own worried worlds. A small boy played quietly with action figures while his father watched the clock. Through the waiting room windows, Chen caught glimpses of hospital staff hurrying past. At one point, he saw the doctor walking toward the operating rooms, already in his scrubs. Their eyes met briefly through the glass. The doctor gave a small professional nod before continuing on his way. That simple gesture, the basic human acknowledgement after everything that had happened, hit Chen hard. Hours crawled by. Chen's aunt dozed in her chair while he continued his restless pacing. Every time the operating room doors opened, every time a surgeon came out to talk to a family, he held his breath. Good news and bad news happened around him. Crying, hugging, quiet conversations in corners. Around noon, a nurse brought him a sandwich he couldn't eat. His aunt urged him to at least drink some water. In his mind, he kept seeing the previous night's events playing over and over. Each time, he noticed something new. The doctor's quiet dignity, his own blind prejudice, the way everyone else had seen what he refused to see. Finally, at 2:30 p.m., the doctor appeared in the waiting room. Chen stood up so quickly he knocked over his untouched coffee. The doctor's face was tired but composed as he approached. Those seconds of walking across the room felt like years to Chen. "Your mother did very well," the doctor said, his voice professional and kind. "The surgery was successful. We were able to repair everything as planned." He explained more details about the procedure, about recovery times and next steps. Chen heard it all through a haze of relief and shame. As the doctor turned to leave, Chen found his voice. "Doctor, I—" But again, the doctor stopped him with a small gesture. "Your mother will be in recovery for about an hour. She'll need you to be strong and focused on her healing. We can talk another time." Chen watched the doctor walk away, amazed again by his professionalism, his humanity. Here was a man who, just hours after being wrongly arrested, had performed intricate surgery for hours to save the life of his arresting officer's mother. In that moment, standing in the hospital waiting room with relief and gratitude washing over him, Chen understood that this wasn't just about his mother's physical healing. Something else was beginning to heal too. Something in him that had been broken for a long time without him even knowing it. 3 days after the surgery, Chen's mother was recovering well, her color improving, her strength slowly returning. She spent most of her time sleeping, but each time she woke, her smile grew a little stronger. The doctor checked on her twice daily, his visits brief but thorough. Chen had tried several times to speak with the doctor, but the timing never seemed right. Sometimes the doctor was rushing to another surgery. Sometimes Chen's own words failed him. How do you apologize for something this big? How do you face your own prejudice when it nearly cost your mother's life? On the 4th day, Chen arrived at the hospital earlier than usual. The morning sun was just starting to stream through the windows as he walked the quiet corridors. He found himself in the hospital cafeteria, clutching a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. That's where the doctor found him. "Officer Chen," the doctor's voice was quiet but clear. He stood there in his white coat, holding his own cup of coffee. "May I join you?" Chen jumped to his feet, nearly knocking over his chair. "Yes, please. I've been wanting to. I need to." The doctor sat down, gesturing for Chen to do the same. For a moment, they sat in silence, two men with a gulf of understanding between them. Finally, Chen found his voice. "I don't know how to begin," he said, his words coming out rough and honest. "What I did that night, there's no excuse. I looked at you and saw what I wanted to see. I didn't see a doctor. I didn't see a human being. I just saw." "You saw what your prejudice showed you," the doctor finished quietly. He wasn't angry, wasn't accusatory. He was stating a simple truth. Chen's eyes filled with tears, something that hadn't happened since his father's funeral. "You could have refused to do the surgery. You could have filed a complaint. You could have told my mother what happened. You had every right to. The doctor stirred his coffee slowly. Would any of those actions have changed anything? Would they have made the world better? Would they have helped your mother? No, Chen whispered. But you helped her anyway, after what I did. I took an oath, the doctor said simply, to help those in need, regardless of who they are. But more than that, I've learned something in my years of practice. Hatred and prejudice are like diseases. They can be treated, but only if we're willing to face them honestly. Chen wiped his eyes roughly with the back of his hand. I've been on the force 15 years. I thought I was serving justice, protecting people. But I was the threat. I was the danger. Recognition is the first step, the doctor said. But it can't be the last. What will you do with this understanding? Chen looked at the doctor directly, really seeing him perhaps for the first time. I want to change. I need to change. Not just for my mother, not just for you, but for every person I've judged wrongly. I don't know how. The doctor leaned forward slightly. Change isn't a destination, Officer Chen. It's a journey. It starts with moments like this, when we're brave enough to face our mistakes and humble enough to learn from them. They talked for nearly an hour. The doctor shared stories of other times he'd faced prejudice, in medical school, in hospitals, in everyday life. Chen listened, really listened, feeling each story like a weight on his conscience, but also like a step toward understanding. As the cafeteria began to fill with morning staff, the doctor stood to leave. Your mother should be discharged in a few days, he said. She's healing well. Chen stood too, extending his hand. Thank you, doctor. Not just for saving my mother's life, but for saving something in me too. The doctor took his hand, shaking it firmly. Remember this feeling, Officer Chen. Remember it every time you put on that uniform. Remember it every time you look at someone and feel those old judgments rising. Remember it and choose differently. As the doctor walked away, Chen sat back down, his coffee now completely cold. But something warm had started growing inside him, something that felt like hope, like the possibility of change, like the beginning of healing. 2 weeks after his mother returned home from the hospital, Chen sat in Lieutenant Rivera's office, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. He had requested this meeting, though every instinct told him to keep quiet, to let things go back to normal. But he couldn't. Not anymore. I want to report myself, Chen said, his voice steady despite his racing heart. I want to formally acknowledge my misconduct during the arrest at the medical center. Rivera leaned back in his chair, studying the officer he'd known for 15 years. He saw something different in Chen's face, a new kind of determination. Chen didn't stop there. He laid out everything. His history of biased decisions, the times he'd let prejudice guide his actions, the arrests he now questioned. As he spoke, the weight he'd carried began to shift. Not getting lighter, exactly, but changing form, from a burden into a purpose. Rivera listened without interruption. When Chen finished, the lieutenant picked up a folder from his desk. I have something to show you, he said, opening it. Inside were papers for a new department initiative. A comprehensive anti-bias training program. We need officers to lead this. Officers who understand why it matters. Chen stared at the papers, understanding the opportunity being offered. Not a pass for his past actions, but a chance to turn them into something meaningful. I'll need help, he admitted. I'm still learning. That afternoon, Chen found himself in a small conference room with Officer Thompson and 2 other officers who had volunteered for the training program. They spent hours sharing stories, confronting uncomfortable truths about their experiences on the force. Thompson spoke about times she'd witnessed bias but stayed silent. Another officer talked about how his views had changed after his son befriended a refugee family. The next week, Chen started taking classes at the local community college, courses in social justice and cultural awareness. He sat in the back, at first, quiet and uncertain. But as weeks passed, He began to participate, sharing his experiences, learning from others' perspectives. His classmates, initially wary of having a police officer among them, began to see him as an ally in their discussions. At the station, things were different too. Chen began reviewing his old case files, looking for patterns he'd been blind to before. He requested that some cases be reopened, facing the disapproval of certain colleagues who thought he was betraying the badge. But he remembered what the doctor had said about change being a journey. One morning, responding to a call about suspicious activity in a park, Chen found himself approaching a group of young men playing basketball. His old instincts flared, but now he recognized them for what they were. Instead of immediately asserting authority, he asked if he could join their game. An hour later, he left with new perspectives and phone numbers for a community youth program. Chen's mother noticed the changes in her son. During their weekly dinners, he spoke differently about his work, about the people he encountered. She saw him reading books he'd never have picked up before, having conversations he'd once have avoided. "You remind me of your father," she said one evening, touching his hand. "He always believed in becoming better." The doctor's words stayed with him. Remember this feeling. Chen did remember every day. When he put on his uniform, when he patrolled his beat, when he interacted with the public. He remembered that night, the shame, the fear, the learning. But now these memories drove him forward instead of holding him back. At the end of his shift each day, Chen would sit in his patrol car for a few extra minutes, writing in a journal. He documented his interactions, his decisions, his moments of doubt and clarity. It wasn't just about avoiding past mistakes. It was about building a new way of seeing, of serving, of being. The change wasn't easy. Some days were harder than others. Some colleagues avoided him now, while others sought his advice. But every time he drove past the medical center, every time he saw a doctor in scrubs, he remembered that sometimes the greatest lessons come from our worst mistakes. And sometimes, true courage means facing the truth about ourselves. 6 months after the incident, Chen stood nervously in front of a packed auditorium at the police academy. Beside him, the doctor arranged his presentation notes. They had been working together for the past few months, sharing their story with new recruits, veteran officers, and medical students. The lights dimmed, and Chen stepped up to the microphone. His hands were sweating, but his voice was clear. 6 months ago, I made the biggest mistake of my career, he began. The room fell silent. I'd arrested a man based on nothing but my own prejudice. That man turned out to be the doctor who would save my mother's life the next day. As Chen spoke, he saw the faces in the audience change. Some showed discomfort, others recognition. A few older officers shifted in their seats, perhaps remembering their own similar moments. The younger recruits leaned forward, taking notes. The doctor then took his turn, describing the arrest from his perspective. He didn't speak with anger or accusation, but with a doctor's precision, dissecting the incident like he would analyze a medical case. He talked about the symptoms of systemic bias, the diagnosis of prejudice, and the treatment of education and understanding. During the question and answer session, a young recruit raised her hand. "How do you work together now?" she asked, looking between them. "After everything that happened." The doctor smiled. "Healing isn't just about fixing what's broken," he said. "Sometimes it's about building something new from the experience." Chen nodded, adding, "Every partnership we build helps heal the divide between law enforcement and the community." Their presentation became a monthly event at the academy. Word spread, and soon other departments began requesting their training program. They traveled to neighboring cities, sharing their story, but more importantly, sharing the tools for change. One day, after a particularly moving session, a veteran officer approached them. His eyes were wet as he confessed to similar biases in his own career. "How do I start making it right?" he asked. Chen and the doctor stayed late that evening, talking with him, sharing resources, offering support. Their work extended beyond the classroom. Chen and the doctor started a mentorship program, pairing officers with community members from different backgrounds. They organized basketball games between police and local youth, followed by dinner and conversation. Simple things, but they made a difference. The local newspaper ran a story about their partnership. From prejudice to progress, the headline read. The article detailed their work, but more importantly, it sparked conversations throughout the city. Other officers began sharing their own stories of confronting bias. Community members started attending police meetings, offering their perspectives. Chen's mother became part of their story too. She attended some of their presentations, sharing how the experience had affected her family. Her presence reminded everyone that these issues touched real lives, real families, real communities. One evening, after a long day of presentations, Chen and the doctor sat in the hospital cafeteria where they'd had their first real conversation. "Did you ever imagine this?" Chen asked, gesturing to their presentation materials. "That night, when I was arresting you." The doctor considered the question. "I've learned that sometimes the worst moments can lead to the best changes," he said, "but only if we're brave enough to face them honestly." Their work wasn't always easy. Some days they faced resistance, skepticism, even hostility. But they kept going, knowing that each person they reached could make a difference. Each mind opened, each perspective changed, was a step towards something better. As they left the cafeteria that evening, they passed the spot where their story had begun. The parking lot where Chen had made his fateful mistake. But now it wasn't just a place of shame. It had become a starting point, a place where two unlikely partners had begun a journey toward change. And in police stations and hospitals across the city, their story was becoming more than just a cautionary tale. It was becoming a blueprint for transformation, a reminder that even the deepest divides could be bridged with understanding, courage, and the willingness to change. 1 year after that fateful night, the police department's community room was filled to capacity. People stood along the walls, some in police uniforms, others in civilian clothes, all gathered to celebrate something remarkable. At the front of the room, Chen and the doctor stood beside a large screen showing statistics that told a powerful story. Complaints against officers had dropped by 40%. Community trust ratings had risen significantly. But more importantly, relationships had changed. The numbers couldn't capture the countless small moments of understanding that had rippled through the city over the past year. Lieutenant Rivera stepped up to the podium, his face proud. "A year ago, we witnessed something rare," he began. "We saw how one incident, which could have deepened the divide between police and community, instead became a bridge." He gestured to Chen and the doctor. These two men chose to turn a moment of prejudice into a movement for change. Chen looked out at the familiar faces in the crowd. There was Officer Thompson, now leading her own anti-bias training sessions. The young basketball players from the park, now regular participants in community police dialogue sessions. His mother, sitting in the front row, beaming with pride. Each person represented a different thread in this new fabric they were weaving. The doctor spoke next, his quiet voice carrying authority. "Change doesn't happen in grand gestures," he said. "It happens in daily choices, in small moments of understanding, in the courage to admit when we're wrong, and the willingness to do better." They played a video showing highlights from the past year, training sessions, community meetings, sports events, shared meals. But the most powerful moments were the simple ones. An officer stopping to play hopscotch with neighborhood kids, community members bringing coffee to officers on cold mornings, people who had once viewed each other with suspicion now greeting each other by name. After the formal presentation, people mingled, sharing stories and food. Chen watched as rookie officers chatted easily with community leaders, as kids high-fived police officers they now knew as friends rather than threats. The walls between us and them were slowly crumbling. A young officer approached Chen, clutching a notebook. "Your story changed how I approach my job," she said. "Now, every time I respond to a call, I remember to look past my first impressions." Her words echoed what many others had shared over the past year. The doctor joined them, carrying 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to Chen, a simple gesture that reminded them both of that morning in the hospital cafeteria when healing began. They had developed an easy friendship, built on shared purpose and mutual respect. Near the end of the evening, a local reporter asked Chen what he was most proud of. He thought for a moment, looking around the room. "This isn't just about police training anymore," he said. "It's about human connection. Every person in this room has their own story of change, their own moment of realization." As people began to leave, Chen's mother approached the doctor. She hugged him, whispering something that made him smile. Then she turned to her son, taking his hand. "Your father would be so proud," she said, "not just of what you've done, but of who you've become." The room slowly emptied, but the impact of their work would continue. Other cities had begun adopting their training program. Their story was being taught in police academies across the country, but more importantly, it was being lived out in daily interactions on streets and in neighborhoods. Chen and the doctor were the last to leave. As they walked through the parking lot, the same lot where their story began, Chen stopped. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't arrested you that night?" The doctor considered this. "Sometimes the worst moments can lead us to our best purpose," he said. "The question isn't what might have been, but what we choose to do with what actually happens." They looked at the hospital building, its windows glowing in the evening light. Inside, lives were being saved. Outside, in ways less visible, but just as vital, other kinds of healing were taking place. Their story had become more than just a cautionary tale. It had become a beacon of hope, showing that change was possible, that bridges could be built, that healing could happen in the most unexpected ways.